The desert wind carried dust and secrets across Thomas Brennan's ranch that October evening in 1885, whispering through the cottonwoods like voices from another world. Thomas stood on his porch, watching the sun bleed crimson across the Arizona horizon, when he saw her, a solitary figure moving slowly along the ridge, silhouetted against the dying light like a ghost materializing from the desert itself. At 53, Thomas had learned to read the desert the way other men read newspapers. He could tell the difference between a wandering cattle thief and a lost traveler, between someone running towards something and someone running away. This woman was neither. She moved with purpose despite her obvious exhaustion, carrying something wrapped in blankets against her chest, her steps deliberate even as they faltered. Thomas's hand instinctively moved toward the rifle beside his door. The Apache wars had left scars across this territory deeper than any canyon, and trust was a luxury most ranchers couldn't afford. His own brother lay buried on a hill not 2 miles from where he stood, killed in a raid 7 years prior. The hatred between settlers and Apache had been fed by blood on both sides until it seemed nothing could ever wash it clean. But something stopped him from reaching for that rifle. Perhaps it was the way the woman stumbled, catching herself against a rock. Perhaps it was the glimpse of desperation in her posture that transcended race or history. Or perhaps, Thomas thought later, it was simply that he was tired, tired of hatred, tired of fear, tired of seeing the world through the scope of a gun. He stepped off the porch and walked toward her, his boots crunching on the gravel. As he approached, the woman straightened, and Thomas could see her more clearly now. She was Apache, probably in her late 20s, with dark eyes that held both wariness and a fierce determination. Her clothing was torn and dusty from hard travel, and dried blood stained her sleeve. But it was what she carried that made Thomas's breath catch, a bundle that moved slightly, letting out a soft, mewling cry. "I mean you no harm," Thomas said, raising his hands slowly. He knew perhaps 20 words of Apache, learned from a scout years ago, and he tried them now, his pronunciation clumsy. The woman's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't move. "Please," she said in English, her voice hoarse from thirst. "My baby. She needs water. Medicine. I have nothing to give." Her accent was thick, but the words were clear, each one seeming to cost her something precious. Thomas had spent 7 years nursing his hatred, feeding it like a campfire that he was afraid to let die because then he'd have to face the cold emptiness it had been hiding. But standing there in the fading light, looking at a mother who would walk through hostile territory, probably for days, to save her child, something inside him cracked. "Come," he said simply, gesturing toward the house. The woman didn't move at first. Her eyes searched his face, looking for the trap, the trick, the inevitable betrayal. Thomas understood. How many times had her people been promised safety only to face violence? How many treaties had been signed and broken? Trust between them should have been impossible, yet here they stood, separated by 10 feet and a chasm of history, both terrified and both hoping. "I swear on my brother's grave," Thomas said, surprising himself with the words. "You and your child will be safe here tonight." Something in his voice, or perhaps in the desperate mathematics of survival, made the decision for her. The woman took one faltering step forward, then another, and then she was following Thomas back to the ranch house, where lamplight glowed warm and golden through the windows. Inside, Thomas's home was simple but clean, a bachelor's domain of practical furniture and sparse decoration. The only ornate thing was a photograph on the mantel, Thomas and his brother, young and smiling, before the desert had taught them the cost of living on its edge. The woman's eyes lingered on it for just a moment before Thomas gestured to the couch. "Sit. Please. Let me get water." The woman lowered herself carefully onto the couch, unwrapping the blankets around the infant with tender precision. The baby, barely a year old, Thomas guessed, was burning with fever. Her tiny face was flushed, her breathing rapid and shallow. Dark hair clung to her forehead with sweat, and even her crying seemed weak, as if she didn't have the strength for more. Thomas brought water and clean cloths, then hesitated. "I'm no doctor," he admitted. "The nearest town is 30 miles. But I've treated fever in calves and horses. The principle might be the same. The woman looked up at him, and for the first time, he saw tears gathering in her eyes, though she fought them back with visible effort. "Anything," she whispered. "Please." For the next hour, Thomas found himself in a strange partnership with this woman whose name he didn't know, working together to bring down the baby's fever. He brought cool water from the well while the woman sponged the infant's skin. He offered willow bark tea, which his mother had sworn by for fevers, and the woman managed to get small sips into the baby's mouth. They worked in near silence, communicating with gestures and glances, united by a single purpose that made all other divisions seem suddenly absurd. As midnight approached, the baby's fever finally broke. Her breathing eased, and the terrible flush faded from her cheeks. The infant fell into a genuine sleep rather than the fevered half-consciousness that had gripped her before. The woman slumped back against the couch, exhaustion finally overwhelming the adrenaline that had kept her moving. "Thank you," she whispered, and Thomas saw tears now flowing freely down her face. "Thank you. What's your name?" Thomas asked, settling into the chair across from her. "Dahana," she replied softly. "It means, she will live. My grandmother gave me this name after I survived the winter sickness as a child." She looked down at her daughter, stroking the baby's hair with infinite gentleness. "I call my daughter Elu." "Morning. Thomas," he offered. "Thomas Brennan. This ranch belonged to my father." Dahana nodded slowly, then looked up at him with those penetrating dark eyes. "You lost someone," she said. "It wasn't a question. I saw your face when you looked at the photograph." Thomas felt the old wound throb. "My brother. Michael. 7 years ago. I lost my husband," Dahana said quietly. 2 years passed. And my parents. My village." Her voice was steady, but Thomas heard the universe of grief compressed into those simple words. "Elu is all I have." They sat in silence for a long moment, two people who should have been enemies, who had every reason to hate each other, bound instead by the simple recognition of shared loss. "Why were you traveling alone?" Thomas finally asked. Dahana's jaw tightened. "There is sickness in the reservation. The white man spotted disease. Smallpox." She spat the word like poison. "The agent says there is no medicine, but I have heard there is a missionary 3 days north who has vaccine. So I left to find him." Thomas felt his stomach turn. He knew the reservations were overcrowded and undersupplied, but he hadn't heard about a smallpox outbreak. 3 days. You walked for 3 days. I would walk for 30, Dahana said simply, looking down at her sleeping daughter. I would walk until my feet were bones if it meant she lived. In that moment, Thomas saw not an Apache woman, not the enemy, not the other, but simply a mother, no different from his own mother had been, no different from any mother anywhere who would move heaven and earth for her child. "Stay tomorrow too," he heard himself say. "Let the baby rest. Let yourself rest. I can ride to town, see if Doc Harrison has any vaccine or medicine I can send with you." Dahana stared at him as if he'd spoken in an unknown language. "Why?" she finally asked. "Why would you help us?" Thomas thought about his brother, about the years of anger he'd carried, about the weight of hatred and what it had cost him. He thought about how small his ranch seemed sometimes, how the silence of it echoed with all the words he'd never said and all the forgiveness he'd never offered. "Because I'm tired of being angry," he said honestly. "And because 7 years ago, someone should have shown my brother mercy, and no one did. Maybe if enough of us choose differently, something changes." Dahana's eyes glistened. "In my language, we have a word, Shurya. It means, my son, but also, it means one who is claimed as family, who is protected as family. Even if blood does not connect you." She paused, weighing her next words carefully. "You show Shurya to us tonight. I will not forget." Thomas felt something shift in his chest, like a door he'd kept locked for years suddenly swinging open. Thomas woke to the smell of coffee and the soft murmur of voices. For a moment, disoriented in the pre-dawn darkness, he thought he'd imagined the previous night. Then he opened his eyes and saw Dahana moving quietly around his kitchen, the baby wrapped against her back in the traditional Apache way, while she prepared breakfast using his meager supplies with the efficiency of someone who could make a feast from nothing. "You should be resting," Thomas said, sitting up and wincing at the stiffness in his neck from sleeping in the chair. Dahana turned, offering him a cup of the coffee she'd brewed. "You showed us kindness. Where I come from, such debts are honored." Her eyes were clearer this morning, and the baby, Elu, looked remarkably better, her eyes bright and curious as she peered at Thomas over her mother's shoulder. Thomas accepted the coffee, surprised by its quality. "Where did you learn to make coffee like this?" "My husband worked for a rancher before everything changed," Dahana said, her voice growing distant. "I learned many things from the rancher's wife. She was kind, like you. She said that good people existed on both sides, that hate was a choice, not a destiny." Dahana's lips curved in a sad smile. "Then the wars came, and choices became harder." Before Thomas could respond, a sound froze them both, the thunder of approaching horses. Many horses. Thomas moved to the window and felt his blood run cold. At least a dozen riders were approaching the ranch, and from their formation and speed, he knew immediately, they were hunting. "The root cellar," Thomas said urgently, turning to Dahana. "Below the kitchen, there's a trapdoor." But Dahana had already seen his face and understood. Her hand flew to a knife at her belt, her body tensing like a cornered animal. "They followed me. They will kill us both now." "They won't find you," Thomas insisted, already moving toward the kitchen. He pulled back a worn rug to reveal the trapdoor. "Please. Trust me one more time." For a heartbeat, Dahana hesitated, every instinct surely screaming at her not to trap herself in a hole in the ground. But then Elu made a small sound, and the mathematics of survival took over again. She descended quickly into the darkness, and Thomas lowered the door, replacing the rug just as boots hit his porch. The pounding on his door was aggressive, military. Thomas took a breath, arranged his face into sleepy confusion, and opened it. The man leading the group was Sheriff Clayton Wade, a hard man made harder by this harsh land. Behind him stood a mix of deputies and what looked like hired guns, all armed, all angry. Thomas's stomach sank when he recognized two of them, Bill Morrison and Jack Tucker, men who'd lost family to Apache raids and had never forgiven, never moved on. "Morning, Sheriff," Thomas said evenly. "Little early for a social call." "Cut the pleasantries, Brennan," Wade growled. "We're tracking an Apache woman. Escaped from the reservation 2 days ago. Witnesses saw her heading this direction." Thomas kept his expression neutral. "Haven't seen anyone. Been quiet out here." Bill Morrison pushed forward, his face flushed with anger and whiskey. "You're lying. We know she came this way. Probably slit your throat and took your supplies by now if she's already moved on." "I'm standing here talking to you, Morrison, so my throat seems fine," Thomas replied dryly. "And I'm telling you, I haven't seen any Apache woman." Wade's eyes narrowed. "Mind if we search the property?" Thomas did mind, terribly, but refusing would only make them more suspicious. "Go ahead. Won't find anything but an untidy bachelor's mess." What followed were the longest minutes of Thomas's life. The men tore through his house with brutal efficiency, overturning furniture, emptying cabinets, checking every corner and closet. Thomas forced himself to stand still, to keep breathing normally, to not glance even once toward the kitchen floor where, beneath the rug and trapdoor, a mother and child hid in darkness, surely barely breathing, hearts surely pounding loud enough to hear. Bill Morrison stomped through the kitchen, missing the trapdoor by inches. Jack Tucker checked the barn, the storage shed, even looked down the well. They found nothing. Finally, Wade turned back to Thomas, frustration evident in every line of his weathered face. "All right, Brennan. Seems we were wrong about her heading here. Seems so, Thomas agreed, keeping his voice steady despite his racing heart. But Morrison wasn't satisfied. I still say he's hiding something. No man lives this far out and doesn't see strange riders or travelers. He's protecting her. Why would I do that? Thomas asked, and then added words that surprised even himself. 7 years ago, Apache killed my brother. You think I'd shelter one now? The words tasted like ash in his mouth, a betrayal of the woman hiding beneath his floor and everything he'd felt the night before. But they worked. Morrison backed down, and Wade nodded slowly. I remember your brother, Wade said, his tone softening slightly. Good man. All right, Brennan. If you do see this woman, she's dangerous. Don't try to be a hero. Just ride for town and tell us. Will do, Sheriff, Thomas lied. He watched from his porch as they mounted up and rode away, heading north toward the mountains. He waited until they were specks on the horizon before returning inside and lifting the trapdoor. Dahana emerged slowly, Elu clutched against her chest. In the dim light from above, Thomas could see the woman was shaking, though whether from fear or rage he couldn't tell. Probably both. You lied for us, she said, her voice strange and tight. Your own people. You lied to them. Yes, Thomas said simply. They will kill you if they find out. They will say you are a traitor. Probably, Thomas agreed. Dahana climbed out of the cellar and stood facing him, and Thomas saw something shift in her expression, a crack in the armor of survival she wore, revealing something raw and vulnerable beneath. Why? She demanded. Why risk this? We are nothing to you. Less than nothing. We are the enemy who killed your brother. Thomas met her eyes. Last night, I watched a mother fight for her child's life with everything she had. I saw love that would cross any desert, face any danger. That's not my enemy. That's just, human. That's what we're supposed to be. Tears spilled down Dahana's cheeks. In my village, there is a story. The old ones tell it to children. They say that before the wars, before the broken treaties, Apache and white men sometimes became true brothers. They say that such bonds were sacred, that they could survive anything. She paused, struggling with emotion. I thought they were just stories. Beautiful lies we tell to help children sleep. Maybe they don't have to be lies, Thomas said quietly. What happened next would become the part of the story that Thomas's grandchildren would never quite believe, that seemed too perfect, too convenient to be real. But it was real, and it changed everything. The sound came from the north, a different kind of thunder. Not horses this time, but something else. Thomas and Dahana rushed outside to see a wall of water surging down the usually dry creek bed that ran behind the ranch. A flash flood, born from storms in the distant mountains, was roaring toward them with terrifying speed. The sheriff's men, Thomas breathed in horror. They're following that creek bed north. They'll be directly in its path. Dahana understood immediately. The very men who'd been hunting her an hour ago were riding straight into a death trap. They'd be crushed, drowned, swept away before they even knew what was happening. We have to warn them, Thomas said, already moving toward his horse. They want to kill me, Dahana said, but her voice held a question rather than a statement. Doesn't matter, Thomas replied, and he meant it. What followed was a desperate race against nature itself. Thomas rode hard, with Dahana running beside him with the supernatural endurance her people were famous for, the baby somehow secure and quiet against her back. The flood was faster, but they had a more direct route, cutting across the ridges while the water followed the winding creek bed. They reached the posse with perhaps 3 minutes to spare. The riders saw them coming and immediately drew their weapons, but Thomas was shouting, pointing back at the wall of water that was visible now, a churning mass of brown destruction bearing down on them like divine judgment. Sheriff Wade was the first to understand. Ride, he screamed. Everyone ride west. Now. The next few minutes were